Would you mind just sharing a little bit on how you sort of see the self with a lowercase s and the self with a capital S, maybe through this Jungian analytical psychological lens?
Sure. I mean, the self is such a key component in Jungian theory. It's very interesting because in 12 steps, we talk about the self as sort of a lower entity, right? Like Bill Wilson uses the word self in sort of a degrading way.
Mm-hmm.
Then in popular culture, often psychologists and stuff will talk about the self as this sort of higher self, right? The self with a capital S. Um, Jung's notion of the self would encompass both of those. So it manifests in both kind of a negative form as like selfishness, self-centeredness, self-reliance, the wrong kind of self-reliance. When it's doing that, it actually does that with the purpose of making contact with the ego, so that the ego, it's really almost like a simplified version is to just say that the self wants the ego to be aware of it. The self wants the ego to recognize that it's not actually in control of the psyche, right? Mm-hmm. That there's a supraordinate sort of entity, which is called the self, that's actually running the show. Jung had taught that, right? That was kind of his sort of main, I guess, psychology or philosophy. The goal was to wake people up to the self. I find it really fascinating that Bill Wilson had also really come to understand the autonomous nature of the psyche, meaning that, because he says that we're often driven, right? We're driven by 100 forms of fear, self-loathing, self-seeking, self-pity. That sense of being driven, right? That's the autonomous psyche, right? And it's driving us probably towards some sort of debacle, so that we will wake up to the fact that we're actually being driven. So it's really a fascinating look. Wilson's it's very strange that he came up with this almost on his own in 1934, 38, 39, when he started writing the big book. Consecutively with Jung, as Jung was developing his theories, Wilson was also really playing around with the same material, I guess. And so, yeah, that's how I see that. And, it's also pretty fascinating that Wilson uses the word self to describe this autonomous psychic complex, if you will. He didn't know anything about Jungian psychology by that point, but the fact that he used the word self is quite interesting to me, for sure.
That is super interesting. Yeah. And this idea that we see, obviously vast, geographical distances and even I think, they're decades apart, right? I believe Jung was maybe 30, 40 years older than Wilson, maybe right around there. But this unique nature of consciousness and that how it's perhaps, on a collective scale, revealing aspects of itself, not just through one individual, right? And we see this kind of collectively throughout history, right? Whether you look at anthropology or archaeology, or these sort of symbols or geometric shapes, whatever it may be, that show up in different cultures at the same time. And perhaps that being an aspect of like the cosmology of consciousness and how it transmits and communicates itself through the numinous, through light, through the divine, to the individual self in a way that drives that individual to then, I don't necessarily want to say pull the collective along with it, but kind of pull the collective along with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's, it's as if, consciousness is sort of expanding, right? And there's a few people who are out on that edge of it that are just, and it's, it's almost as if they're just sort of going along for the ride, and they're kind of describing what they're seeing as it's happening. And certainly Wilson and Jung were among those on the edges of consciousness, right?
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of us are, right. We might not be famous, psychologists or philosophers, but just having these kinds of conversations is something that helps, right? Like we help to move this thing forward. Something that's fascinating to me about psycho-spiritual growth, I guess, and that I've really just learned through studying Jungian stuff and writing this book, was that what happens in the collective, the collective sort of the collective psyche, the collective psychology, is waking up, and it's really the same process as the individual waking up, right? That these two entities, if you will, they have to go through the same functions in order to expand and to grow and to wake up. So I really find it really interesting. And as we wake up as individuals, right, we're helping the collective to also wake up as well.
Mm-hmm.
Another fascinating idea is that, and Jungians will talk about this a lot, like the most fundamental change that takes place in the human consciousness as a person transforms or individuates will be their conception of God, or the God image, right? That and as the God image changes, the human being changes, right? And if the God image is fixed, then the human being literally stays stuck. And so the more, the more that the God image changes on a collective scale as well, right? As the God image changes, then we can change more and more, which is very interesting considering the fact that we've collectively, at least in the West, we've been sort of worshiping the same fixed God image for almost 2,000 years,
Mm-hmm.
and it's fascinating to me that, and here we are, we're kind of stuck in this kind of weird limbo, sort of in a mythless culture, right? Which is what we started out talking about. So,
Yeah.